Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink podcast. Today, I have with me Dr. Monica Osborne. She is a writer. She is a former professor. Her specialty is in multi-ethnic literature, trauma, and critical theory. And those are all things that we're going to talk about today. And of course, with my co-host, David Bernstein. Monica, always ask, what are we going to have for this conversation? What are you drinking?
Very, very strong coffee with heavy cream.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Coffee without cream is, that's not coffee to me.
Not good. Not good.
Now, David, you promised scotch in this call. Did you deliver?
Yes. I'm having scotch, and you know what? It's my last scotch before Passover, which starts tomorrow night.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm doing something that I've done before. I've got peanut butter whiskey that I put in my coffee. So I've got the coffee and the whiskey going on. Hey, but David, I've got a question for you. With Passover, is in the Jewish tradition, is there drinking or not drinking? Is that like, there
are things you can drink, like certain kinds of vodka and certainly wine, but there's a lot you can't drink. You want to riff on that, Monica?
Yeah, David, I'm assuming that your neighbors are going to hold on to your scotch for the next week.
Right.
The idea is that we have to get rid of anything with grains. We have to get all of that out of the house. So we'll temporarily sell something to a neighbor or a friend for $1, and then we'll buy it back when Passover's over and bring it back into the house and indulge.
Well, can you get?
I've been a little less strict than what Monica just entailed.
Me too.
Well, can you give it away, or does it have to be sold? Like, can you just say, like, here, I'm going to give it to you to hold for me, or does it have to actually like somehow change hands in a financial transaction?
It's actually a financial transaction, which is a bit of a legal fiction. So you sell it to your rabbi, and then you buy it back at the end of the holiday.
Oh my gosh, that's fascinating.
Who actually sells it then to somebody who's not Jewish. It's a elaborate legal fiction that's part of sort of the cleansing of your cupboards and your life and the cleaning up of your home.
Well, so we've got Easter as a Protestant next weekend. We've got our certain traditions and celebrations, but none of it has to be such a cleanse. But that would be, well, I guess, we do have Lent. Some people will give up on certain things. It's not really a cleanse, but it's usually like alcohol. Obviously, clearly, I did not give up on alcohol for Lent. So there we go. Anyways, but that's not what we're here to talk about. David, you listened to Monica speak and you were just fascinated with where her position. Give us a little more information.
Monica, you were talking about critical race theory and how we might think about it. Last week, I believe it was, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida announced a ban of critical race theory altogether. What did you think about that?
Yeah, so I really think it's the wrong strategy to ban it, and this is something I've written about recently. I think just to go back to the university and the academy, I actually studied at the Cornell School of Criticism and Theory. This is, a powerhouse institution for critical theory, for critical race theory, for all of these, different ways of looking at literature and the world and everything. But it always felt to me like something that was going to stay in the academy. Right. But over the past, and, not that we don't use these things out in the real world, we do. And I think that's really important. And I think it matters. But I never expected, a specific theory, critical race theory in this regard to go free flying through the streets. It's been released and it's out there and it's doing its thing and it's taking over. Um, I don't necessarily think that it's the worst thing in the world, though, right? It's just that it's been released and it's the only lens that's being used right now. And I think most people outside of academia don't really know what critical race theory is. They just hear it being demonized on, mostly on the right, and they see, what's happening with regard to it being used as the only lens through which to see everything. And so, we become understandably very fearful of it. And so, we want to completely reject it. We want to get rid of it. We want to root it out like it's the worst thing that's ever hit our culture. And I think that's really problematic for a couple of reasons. The first is that if we ban it, or if we say it's not allowed, or if we talk about it, or we frame it as the most evil sensibility of all, we're going to get a lot of pushback from the other side, right? It's simply not going to work. I think it's a poor strategy. But on the other hand, even within the genre of critical race theory, there are a number of competing voices. You take somebody like Henry Louis Gates Jr., is he's a mainstream popular academic. He's got a different perspective of things than somebody like, say, Ibram Kendi, who's kind of a newcomer to the discourse. They have very different ideas about how race works in American culture. But we're just saying, oh, critical race theory, it's bad. We have to get rid of it. So when I used to teach critical theory at various universities, I would teach critical race theory. I would teach feminist theory, psychoanalytic theory, Marxist theory, new criticism, all of these different lenses through which to see things. But the catch is that you don't use just one, right? You're supposed to deploy multiple lenses to look at the same event or the same book or the same film or whatever it is you're looking at. So the problem here is that only one lens is being used, right? It's only critical theory. And, this has been one of the problems with the California ethnic studies curriculum. That's been a big fight, right? The problem there is that critical race theory is the primary lens through which everything is seen and created. And that's why it's problematic. It's not necessarily that critical race theory is the problem. It's that it's the only perspective we're using, and we're completely disregarding all of these other ways to see these experiences.
So what is the critical race theory lens? I should have probably asked you that before I asked you what you thought about it being banned.
Sure. So critical race theory, this is something that was created by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell in the late 80s, early 90s, around that time. And this was in response to what they saw as ways in which people in the Black community were maybe receiving different sentences than a white person who may have committed the same crime, right? So inequalities in the legal system, and I think it was an important thing. I don't think it was ever a bad thing. I think it's a really good thing. But really, this is oversimplifying it probably, but the major premise of critical race theory as a genre is that everything in society, every ill, everything that's wrong is a result of systemic racism, right? So every American institution is riddled with racism, and it's something that we can't necessarily overcome. And even though we have to keep fighting against it, we can't overcome it, right? So it's like it's a real paradox, right? It's like you have to fight against it, but you're also being told that you'll never be able to get rid of it. So, in some ways it becomes this, I don't know, self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts.
You said something though, and I'm glad that you kind of laid it down for us. I think you said you expected it to something that stayed in the academy, right? And that we've seen that it's moved out of the academy. And when I speak to, and I use this term like common folk, like people who aren't academics, everyday people, there's a feeling that there's something going on, that there's something wrong, particularly I think within the white community, because there is this feeling that, this shame and this blame and whatnot, and they're not quite sure where it's coming from. And the fact that it actually trickled down from academia in this kind of critical theory, it's nice to put words to it for someone who isn't an academic to kind of understand what it is that they're seeing, because it does feel like it's everywhere. And so much so, wanted to touch on another thing you said, that we're starting to introduce it into K through 12 schools. So again, we're talking like little kids who don't have no idea, who don't have the language for critical theory, critical social justice, critical race theory, are being taught it. So it's kind of infused into our system without the proper language or without the proper pushback, because a lot of people don't know what they know something feels wrong, but they don't know what to push back against. And I feel like that's a challenge. You see a lot of parents now going, wait, I don't understand what's going on in the school districts. I would love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts about that in the school district. I looked a little bit at the California school planning, and some of it, like you said, some of it I think is fabulous. I mean, I think that we are addressing things that we have not addressed in the past. We are giving agency in some respects to Black actors that we have not addressed in the past. And so, in that aspect, to me, it's beautiful. It's wonderful. But in the other aspect, where a lot of it is centered on oppression, oppressed and oppressor, and very binary ideas, I think that we're doing a disservice not only to all of our kids, not just the white kids who are like, I have no idea what you're talking about, to the Black kids and brown kids and whatever, any kids of any other color that are being told that, like you said, everything is oppression. You can do what you can, but sorry, at the end of the day, it's still oppression, which I think
Right.
is what you said basically when you explain what critical theory is. So I would love to get your feedback on how we are teaching it and how we can, particularly with young kids, how do we have that conversation with the schools and do a better job of introducing it, but not relying solely on it. Introducing it so that we bring in better conversations around race and issues of discrimination without relying on it and actually taking us backwards to even more discrimination.
Right, right. So, you mentioned the binary of oppressor and oppressed, and this is really what it comes down to. I mean, this goes back to the German Enlightenment. This goes back to Hegel, right, and the master-slave dichotomy. It's like, we can only understand ourselves as an oppressor or somebody who is oppressed, right? So this is this binary that different movements keep picking it up, and it never really works. And of course, there are also communities and groups of people that problematize these binaries, like Jews in particular. Where you put Jews? Are they oppressors? Well, if you ask the far left, yes, they're oppressors. If you ask the far right, are Jews oppressors? Well, yes, they're oppressors. But then you've got all of these other people in between who are like, well, no, Jews are, an ethno-religious minority that has endured, centuries of persecution. This is a group of people that's discriminated against. So, there are certain groups of people that problematize the binary. And this is something I've been dealing with at my son's private school in Los Angeles. It's actually become a really big issue. And just to give you a little bit of background regarding the school, it's a wonderful school that has always done diversity and compassion and all of these things really, really well. I mean, one of the reasons you choose this school is because you value diversity, you value difference. And, it's always been this magical school where everybody gets along, everybody respects and values everyone's differences. But then the protests of last summer happened and everybody started to believe that they're not doing enough. We're not doing enough. We have to create DEI committees. So, schools really quickly rushed to create these committees of people who, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, don't know what the heck they're doing. They don't even know what critical race theory is.
Right.
They don't know anything about curriculum. They don't have any formal training in this field. And yet they're suddenly expected to make all of the decisions for the school. And this is something that happened at my son's school. We had an anti-bias training session for parents. last November that went horribly, horribly wrong. And this is something I've written about. And it's become a bit of an obsession ever since this happened, because I felt really blindsided. I was shocked that, we could have this wonderful community and then suddenly be told we're not doing enough. And, again, I think we can always do more. I think all of us can always do more. We can always do better. We can always think about, the ways in which we might have implicit biases that affect the way we deal with people. That's a good thing. But, it's what's happening in the schools. It's really kind of gone off the rails. So what happened at this particular school, and it's what's happening in all the LA private schools. For instance, this particular school announced that they're going to use a curriculum by the organization called Teaching Tolerance, which sounds great, right? Teaching tolerance. Don't we all want that? Interestingly, they've recently rebranded as, I think it's Learn or Learning for Justice, which makes a little bit more sense. But I combed through every newsletter on that website, every piece of information, because I wanted to know what it was. And I was really kind of stunned by some of the things I read. One of the things that they push for, this organization that's now creating curriculum for so many schools, is literally and figuratively centering Black and brown students and moving other students to the perimeters. So in a classroom, you would put all of your Black and brown students in the middle and in the front, and you would literally move other students to the perimeters. Now, the question is always, well, what do you do with children who are mixed race? I'm thinking about, my son's school in Los Angeles. There are a number of mixed race families. What do you do? And we know that, I'm sure you guys are aware of, I don't remember his name, but there's a big lawsuit happening right now with regard to a mixed race high school student who was asked to identify himself as an oppressor because of his white side. And he didn't feel comfortable doing that. And so they weren't going to give him a grade for the course. So now there's this whole big lawsuit with that. So again, so many people problematize these binaries. So many people aren't just Black or just white, right? So there's one problem. And then, another thing that they suggest that teachers do, that they ask teachers do, is, don't call on any of your white students. If they raise their hands, you call on your Black students, you call on your brown students. If there's time, you call on your white students. And, I spoke with a friend recently who felt that that was a really positive thing, because in so many instances, Black people have felt that they can't speak up, or they've been afraid to, and this is her perspective. And so she feels like this really, takes a stab at leveling the playing field, right? So that's the perspective. And that, I hear that viewpoint, I accept it as legitimate, and I listen to it and I understand it. But I don't really think it's going to work that way when we're talking about elementary school students. I can just imagine, what white children becoming very resentful of, Black and brown children who are being allowed to speak when they aren't allowed to speak. So I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it in the long run is going to work toward leveling the playing field or creating harmony between different races. I think it's the recipe for an even bigger culture war than we're already in.
Hmm. So this idea of sort of centering the Black experience or the experience of minority groups grows out of what's sometimes referred to as standpoint epistemology. It's that the idea that that marginalized people can define racism and persecution in their own voice based on their lived experience. And it also, correct me if I'm wrong, grows out of critical race theory as well. It's one of the maybe two major platforms or ideas within critical race theory. And yet it seems to me that that's where some of the potential breakdown society-wide will occur, if people believe that only they get to define their own experience and that others are asked to defer to it. That's not going to be an enduring moral vision for society to overcome some of the problems that we have. Even if I agree with every claim you make about, or somebody else makes about racism embedded in social structures, and I agree that in every case you're right, I'm still not sure, and I don't believe that this formulation of standpoint theory will allow us to overcome those problems. What do you think about that? How do you think about that issue?
Okay, so something I find really problematic is this whole phrase "lived experience." Right? It sounds really good and really important. I think, right? I have experiences that are unique to me because I have lived them, I have felt them, and only I can tell you what those are and what those mean. I mean, it sounds like it makes sense, but the problem is that it's not. And this is where we need the psychoanalytic theory lens, right? We need to bring that lens in, and we need to think about why we feel certain ways, because sometimes what we feel, our lived experience, is not necessarily rooted or grounded in reality, right? And it makes me think of I found certain elements of the Me Too movement to be a little bit distressing. And in the beginning, I couldn't figure out why I was distressed by the movement. And I realized at a certain point that it was, this hashtag that went around for a while, "Believe all women."
Mhm.
And I think it would have been better if it had been, listen to all women, listen to all women, take them seriously, and investigate their claims, right? But that doesn't make a good hashtag. So
That's a long hashtag.
right, yeah,
Investigate all the claims, listen to all
yeah, don't let me make hashtags because they'll be ridiculously long and nobody will want them. Um, but it's like this oversimplification of things. So we're going back to the binary, right? It's the black white, it's the either or, because that nuanced, complex gray space is too hard to politicize. First of all, right? The right can't grab it, the left can't grab it, you can't do anything with that. It needs to be a binary in order to weaponize it for political purposes. So again, this idea of lived experience, well, that means if I feel like, if I don't, as a woman, as a woman who I'm Jewish, I also have Hispanic ancestry. So if I don't get a job, maybe I feel that it's because I'm a woman, or because I'm Jewish, or because someone found out I'm part Hispanic. Maybe that's true, but it might not be true. But if I feel that it's true, then it's true. And this is the idea of lived experience. And, you can see how this quickly becomes really, really problematic. So, in terms of, I also though think that, groups of people do have a right to define to a certain extent what, racism or bigotry against their group is, right? Or what it looks like. For instance, what happened, the shooting in Atlanta this week, the horrible shooting, it was it six Asian women were killed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, of course, the shooter is saying, well, it had nothing to do with their race or ethnicity. It had everything to do with these other things, and my own, sexual obsessions. So you've got some people saying, well, see, it wasn't racially motivated at all. But most people in the Asian community felt that it was racially motivated. And, I think that sometimes if I'm Jewish, if a shooter goes into a synagogue and kills people, I know that it's because they're Jewish. But in so many cases, we'll see, we don't know if it's a hate crime yet. And as a Jewish person, I say, what do you mean you don't know it was a hate crime? They walked into a synagogue, and that's how, people in the Asian community feel. Many people, the shooter walked into a place, that had, many Asians working there, and shot people. This is a hate crime. This is racially motivated. So, there is something about lived experience that I think is valuable, but again, it needs to always be part of a larger dialogue.
But isn't it used sometimes by groups to say, this is my lived experience, so you must therefore accept my ideology of racism that goes far beyond just my lived experience. It's also critical race theory or critical social justice. And therefore, in being an ally with me, you have to believe X, Y, and Z And it's at that point where I push back and say, I hear you. I want to hear your voice. I do have a responsibility as somebody who's white and lived in this society and benefited from it, to hear your stories and to understand your plight. But at the same time, I reserve the right to disagree with your ideology or your ideological claims.
Right, right. So I I don't know. I mean, I just it's hard because I do, people do have a right, if I'm going to be sensitive to things as a woman, as a Jew, that someone who is, a guy who is not Jewish is not going to be as tuned into, right? And I think that matters. But at the same time, I can't use that to, dictate what everybody else is supposed to feel or what they're supposed to see. But again, I think, and again, actually, I should say that critical race theory doesn't necessarily tell people to do that. The problem here is how critical race theory is being used and misused in schools. It's being deployed as this way to manipulate the entire structure of education so that it serves the emotional needs of certain groups of people. So again, like we keep talking about critical race theory, but critical race theory doesn't necessarily dictate that we do that. Again, there's so many different voices and perspectives in critical race theory, even though, of course, the underlying idea is that systemic racism, it's everywhere. It affects, Black people in every community. But at the same time, there are different voices, but we're not getting that the way it's being infused into schools and into education and programs. And, I think it's very clear that, critical race theory is being used to push another agenda, which is a very political agenda, right? I mean, we see elements of Marxism in so much of the critical race theory. I'm thinking of the teaching tolerance curriculum, for example. I mean, they literally say, like, we're hearing all over the place now, math is political, math needs to be political. And they give all of these examples of how teachers in elementary school should be making math political. So when you teach math, teach children about how numbers have been used to hurt different communities. It's stuff that belongs in social studies. Fine, teach that if you want to teach that, but not in math, right? They need to be able to do math first. So that's one of these problems with it.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because we've been hearing a lot about, math is racist, science is racist, and I think that you make a great point. I mean, if you want to teach that, but not still teach math. Still teach science, but if you want to teach the history of math or the history of numbers or whatnot, that's a different topic. But I've got a question actually for both of you. I think David and I agree on this point, but I don't want to speak for him. Both of us are very much believe that racism is a thing. We're not racism deniers, but I wonder, at least, I think David may as well, is it systemic? And in critical theory, like we mentioned at the very beginning, or you mentioned, Monica, that it's baked into every single thing, and there's really just nothing you can do about it. Is that really? I mean, if that's the case, it's kind of like.
Can I answer first, because then you can respond to both of us. I believe that there is systemic racism, but I don't necessarily believe America itself is systemically racist. In other words, I believe there are pockets of systemic racism, and I worry that sometimes calling America either systemically racist or white supremacist actually makes it hard to locate the systemic racism that does exist in society. It sort of treats it in too general terms, and we're not able to then break it down and then apply our critical lenses to those instances in a way that's going to actually solve the problems.
Nice clarification. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that that's part of the problem. And, we're, you can be called a racist for anything and everything now. And, I've said it, a number of people have said, if everyone's a racist, then no one's a racist. And, again, racism is a problem. It's still a big problem. But again, going back to this question of, is America just at its roots, at its core, racist? I don't believe that it is. I see the structure in a different way. I see, there is racism, threaded through it. And I think that in many ways we've worked to fight that. We've rooted some of it out. It is still going to be a problem. I don't know if it's something we can ever eradicate. I mean, I think that humans are just, biologically predisposed to be suspicious of difference that they can see, or difference that they simply perceive, right? We're innately hostile to difference. And I think we're always trying to overcome that. And of course, in places that are very racially and ethnically diverse, like Los Angeles or New York or Miami, I think it's less of an issue, right? Because it's not, we don't perceive it as difference anymore. I'm used to seeing people of all races and ethnicities around me, and I just see people. I just see people who I like and people who I don't like, and it doesn't have anything to do with what they look like. So again, if we say that America is systemically, endemically racist at its core, there's no way to get past that unless we completely dismantle, deconstruct American culture and all American institutions. And I think for some, that is the goal. And, the critical race theory lens is a way for them to work toward that agenda. So sometimes I wonder if, I just wonder sometimes if the Black community is being used for a different agenda. And I think that's a concern because, again, all of the ways in which I see racism being fought right now, I don't see this working. I see it building more resentment. I see it creating division. This isn't the Martin Luther King idea of colorblindness and of bringing people together and of judging people on, the content of their character as opposed to the color of their skin. This is a movement where we are supposed to judge people based on the color of their skin. So, if you are white, you are upholding white supremacy and systemic racism, and there's nothing you could do to overcome it. There's nothing you can do.
Are we seeing though that the people who are making this argument conflating the idea of a dominant culture, which you have in literally every society in the world, or dominant cultures, with the idea of supremacism? In other words, you live in a society. There tends to be a dominant group of people that have been around longer than everybody else. They define the dominant culture. I would say in a healthier, more pluralistic society, they allow more porousness and fluidity, and they allow others to come into that dominant society and help change it. But what's being called supremacy, I'm really just thinking out loud about this, and something I've been struggling with myself. So I love your opinion on it. What I really worry is that this idea of the dominant culture is not necessarily supremacist unless it actually functions as in a supremacist matter, and that what they're doing is they're saying that's whiteness, that's white culture, and so therefore inherently it's white supremacist, when really that's not what we're dealing with. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think those terms matter. I think white supremacy is a very specific thing. I think that it's, when people decide, literally say to themselves, I don't like people who look like this, and, actively work against. But, in any country, if you've got a dominant culture, there are always going to be, in many instances or many ways in which that dominant culture does discriminate against the less dominant culture. That's going to happen. So, we can't say that those kinds of discriminations don't exist, because they do, if only because we have a dominant culture and we have a less dominant culture, a number of less dominant cultures. But is it white supremacy? I don't think it always is. Sometimes it is. And that's the problem, because there are many legitimate instances of white supremacy. And, I also don't think that, white supremacy is only neo-Nazis and, people carrying torches in Charlottesville. Of course, that's white supremacy, but I think it is other things too. So I think it's complicated, but I think that, Americans right now, especially, don't want to think through anything in complex, nuanced ways. It's much easier to, again, break everything into that binary, into that good or evil, black versus white. I don't mean that in terms of race, it's either or, because again, you can't mobilize nuance and complexity, but you can mobilize and weaponize this, good versus evil thinking. And you see it on the left and you see it on the right. The left, most people on the left think everybody on the right is evil. I mean, I saw this on my own, in my own social media world, just coming up to the election. I had, and I'm a liberal, I'm proudly liberal, classically liberal, I should say. But I saw so many of my friends on the left, the majority of them actually, they would say things, now make announcements on social media. If I find out any of my friends are voting for Trump, we're no longer friends, and then it became not just about Trump, but if I find out anybody's voting Republican, I don't want anything to do with you. Just tell me now so I can delete you. All of these very polarizing. I mean, and we're seeing, you see it on the right too. I have so many friends who are on the right who just think liberals and progressives are, part of the same, they're the same thing, and they're all bad, and they're all trying to destroy the country, so we see this on both sides, and there's no dialogue, there's no nuanced thinking. And I think it could be the death of us if it keeps going this way.
Well, that's such a good point, and I really do feel that social media has made it easier for us to fall into that binary, because again, it's hard to really explore the middle and that gray area in whatever 280 characters or whatnot. But the huge question is, what can we, outside of these conversations that we're having, which I think one of the reasons Dave and I are having these conversations, and hopefully bringing other people into that conversation. What can we do? I mean, it just seems it's easy. It's easy to be binary. It's easy to be binary. Social media facilitates being binary. Do you have any other solutions for us to kind of embrace that complexity that is who we are?
Yeah, I think we have to keep doing what we're doing. I think we have to keep talking about it. And, I mean, we've seen so many in the past 6 months, we've seen so many journalists on the left who have left their, fiercely liberal leaning publications to write on Substack or to go other places because they were being told they weren't left enough. And these are people who are staunchly on the left. But so I seeing this movement in the world of journalism is, it makes me feel hopeful. I think there are a lot of people who are out there writing about it, talking about it. I think the more difficult place, and I think, the most crucial part of this fight is in the schools, quite frankly, because again, if children are going to be taught through this one lens, this one perspective from kindergarten up, we're going to have a big problem in 5 to 10 years. So, for me, it's been speaking out about what's happening at, my son's school and other schools. And, I have written a couple of pieces about it, and I've received, many emails from parents at the school who are like, thank you for saying something, but I can't publicly agree with you. Right. So this is part of the problem. I think that most people feel like we do. I think most Americans are moderate. They're not extreme. And I think that, if people really understood what, some of these critical race theory programs are demanding of their children and them, they wouldn't be on board with it. But the problem is they don't know. It's like, my son's school, you hear teaching tolerance curriculum. That sounds fabulous. It sounds beautiful. Right. And, the program itself has many components that I think are wonderful, and that's the tricky thing. You see these things that are beautiful and wonderful, and you want your children to be exposed to them, but there's this other darker side that gets imported with the good. So I think that people have to speak out, and I think the more people who speak out against it, not in a hateful, rageful way, but in a thoughtful way. I think that's the only thing we can do right now. But people see that there's a price to pay when you speak out, and in many cases, that is ostracization or alienation from your school community. I've definitely had a couple friends at the school who've said, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but it's not your right to say it because you're not Black. And they're very hurt by the fact that I would speak out, and they don't see it as my place. And, I hear that and I think, okay, it's a valid point. I don't know that I agree with that, but I hear that as a valid point. And so I think that we have to try to listen to the other side and try to, accept and acknowledge when there are points that are good or valid, even if we don't agree with them. Because, if we're this extreme and this extreme fighting against each other, nobody's going to listen. Nobody's going to listen.
Let me push back on that. Well, I'm not really pushing back because I largely agree with you. And but there is a camp within the sort of anti-woke movement. And these are mostly liberals, by the way. These are people who would probably agree politically on many of the issues, who say, I'm sorry, but right now we need to mount a counter campaign that gets people angry so that we can provoke a black backlash. And if it means a little bit of illiberalism on the right by getting Governor DeSantis to ban CRT altogether, we'll end up somewhere different in the end. We know that we'll end up landing with CRT taught as one of many theoretical lenses that you could teach at a school. But for the time being, we need to just fight and stop with all this nuance. And when you're so worried about, banning critical race theory, which is really not going to happen in the end, you're actually making it harder for us to fight the good fight, to actually create a balance of forces. And this is a force. I mean, they have a good point. There's a force, and they're not so nuanced all the time. The people pushing CRT are not so nuanced. And I'm saying this as someone who just co-authored with my co-host, Jennifer, and a former guest, Amna Khalid. We co-authored a piece that's coming out next week saying that there needs to be a third way on critical race theory in schools, and believing that Governor DeSantis was wrong and that we need to actually teach it in a critical way. But there's a part of me, there's a part of my brain, that's the political part. I've been in the advocacy world most of my life, that says they've got a point. Maybe we need to mount a campaign and really fight this like we would any other advocacy issue. What do you think about that?
No, I get it. If you've got, everybody on the far left is so extreme, and they're very organized, right? They've been able to very quickly get this into all the schools. I mean, seemingly overnight. That's been something that's been mind blowing to me, how quickly it happened, how quickly our curriculums were changed. Like everybody just said, okay, so it is extreme. And it's happening fast. So I do understand the need on, the perceived need on the right, to kind of mount a defense and treat this as a war or a game in which, who has the best strategy will be victorious. So I get it, but I just don't think it's going to work. I think, everybody's about to boil over right now, and I just don't think it works. Then again, I come from the academic world. I've taught philosophy again and critical theory, so I like to sit in a room and quietly, think through all of these things with a glass of wine. The question is, does that work in the real world? And, I don't know. I tend to think it's going to be a balance of both, some strategy as well as some nuanced dialogue that will be key, but I don't know.
One of the enduring things that I learned freshman year philosophy class, and it's so funny because it's like the one thing when you sit back and go, what did I learn in college, right? There's like one thing, and I go back to this, and I don't really like it, but I think it's truthful, is you have to have extreme voices to finally fall in the middle. Yes. And so I think, David, what I'm hearing you say, and I think I agree, even though I don't like, and you and I just wrote a piece saying, I don't like how the right is addressing critical race theory. I think if you don't have that extreme, then you don't fall to the middle. You almost have to, so that the rest of us, most of us who are, in the middle, kind of go, oh, okay, I see that. Let's bring it back down a notch. But you have to go to that point where you're like, okay, no,
We're the landing pad and all that.
Right.
There needs to be a good cop and a bad cop in any social movement.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I need to give my bad cop friends, as long as they don't go too far off the reservation or they become bad cops as in criminals, I need to give them some leeway, knowing that we're going to provide the actual solutions in our more moderate approaches in the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Just a thought. I'm still struggling with myself.
Me too.
I think that's a really good point, though. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that, hey, we should all just be in the center. This is where everybody should be. So I don't feel that way at all. I really think we need all of these voices. And, again, a friend I was talking to the other day, I'd written a piece for Newsweek about DEI committees and the disproportionate power that they have. And she'd said, I don't disagree with anything you said, but you shouldn't have said it because you're not Black. You shouldn't have said it. And then at one point she said, she's, involved in activism and, she's a big player in some of these arenas. And, she said, you need to help, you need to get on board. You need to do this. And, she said, I'm an activist, I'm extreme. And I said, listen, we need you. We need people like you. I want to hear from people like you. I want to be able to, know how to calibrate my own feelings and ideas. And we need these other voices on both sides to be able to do that. And I said to her, though, but we also need people like me, right? It's not just people who are activists and who are going with the emotion of the moment, of the movement, all of this emotional energy. We also need people who are going to try to sit in the middle and look at both sides and think about it. We need people who are going to sit there and think critically and deeply about it, which is interesting because this is critical theory. This is, in some ways, this is why I do this, because I've been trained to think this way. So again, it's crazy to see critical race theory being used in the way that it's being used, because it's supposed to be a really important tool to help us, with so many other tools, to think about what's happening in society.
Great. Well, I don't have any further questions. I think
I'm almost
really helped elucidate some of these issues for us. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I do. Me too. I really like that at the end though, talking about that swing, because I think what we can do in the middle, and it's not that we're in the middle in the sense that we don't have a point of view. I talked about this on another podcast. I mean, being in the center doesn't mean that you don't have a point of view and you're not willing to fight for it. But I think that we are in some ways maybe the facilitators of pulling that pendulum back through these conversations.
Carving out the space that allows people from the right and the left to come together and have the conversations to actually solve problems in the end. And I think that's an important place to occupy.
And I don't think we're doing that enough as a society, because things feel like they have gotten so extreme, but I mean, here we are doing it now. So
yeah. I want to mediate. Like, that's what I want to do. I have friends on both sides. I want to mediate. Sometimes sometimes the left makes great points. Sometimes the right makes good points. And, I just want to mediate. And that's an unpopular position right now, but I think we have to keep working toward that.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Thanks, Monica.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.